Hello and welcome to my tutorial about comparative advantage and the gains from trade. In this video, I am going to discuss the concepts of comparative and absolute advantage and how countries can benefit even when they trade with partners who may not be as efficient as they are at producing certain goods. To start, it's important to make a distinction between absolute and comparative advantage. We talk about absolute advantage when we observe an individual or a nation take absolutely less time to perform an activity or produce a greater quantity of a good. We talk about comparative advantage when we observe an individual or a nation perform an activity or produce a good at a lower opportunity cost, when they're relatively more efficient at that activity. As it turns out, this difference between absolute and relative comparisons will be key to our understanding of how individuals should go about sharing chores or choosing jobs, or how countries should specialize in production and trade. Let's see an example. Here I'm talking about Annie and Bruno, two people, but we could generalize our analysis to countries. Just think of country A and country B, or Australia and Belgium if you want. What information does this table contain? Both Annie and Bruno have limited time to pick fruit, say one afternoon a week. It doesn't really matter. If Annie devotes all the time she has available to pick fruit, she can pick 20 pounds of apples, or she can pick 20 pounds of cherries. If Bruno devotes all the time he has available to pick fruit, he can pick 30 pounds of apples or 60 pounds of cherries. One thing is quite obvious right off the bat. Bruno can pick more of either fruit than Annie. So, Bruno has an absolute advantage in picking apples, and he has an absolute advantage in picking cherries. Conversely, Annie has an absolute disadvantage in picking apples and an absolute disadvantage in picking cherries. She can pick less of them. Now let's look at the opportunity cost Annie and Bruno experience in their fruit picking. Let's begin by looking at Annie's choices. Annie can, in her time, pick either 20 pounds of apples or 20 pounds of cherries. This is an easy calculation. If Annie wants to pick 1 more pound of apples, that's going to cost her 1 pound of cherries. And if she wants to pick 1 more pound of cherries, she will have to forego 1 pound of apples. Looking at Bruno now. Bruno can pick either 30 pounds of apples or 60 pounds of cherries. This means that in order to pick 1 pound of apples, he will have to forego 2 pounds of cherries. Conversely, if he wants to pick 1 pound of cherries, he will have to forego picking half a pound of apples. Looking at the problem through the optic of opportunity cost, we see that Annie has a lower opportunity cost at picking apples because she has to forego 1 pound of cherries, whereas Bruno has to forego 2 pounds of cherries, and we see that Bruno has a lower opportunity cost at picking cherries because he has to forego half a pound of apples, whereas Annie has to forego 1 pound of apples. This means that we have found our pattern of specialization according to comparative advantage. Bruno has a comparative advantage in cherries and a comparative disadvantage in apples. And Annie has a comparative advantage in apples and a comparative disadvantage in cherries. Now let's look at this problem using production possibilities frontiers. We can see just looking at the slope of the PPFs that Bruno's is flatter than Annie's, and that means that he has a lower opportunity cost in picking cherries, since the slope of the PPF gives us the opportunity cost of the good measured in the x-axis directly. Since Annie has a lower opportunity cost in apples, or a comparative advantage in apples, she should forget about picking cherries and devote all of her available time to picking apples. Similarly, Bruno, who has a comparative advantage in picking cherries, should forget about picking apples and devote all of his available time to picking cherries. To help us illustrate how they benefit from this complete specialization, assume that before learning about comparative advantage, Annie was consuming 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries, and Bruno was consuming 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries. That's a lot of cherries. This is just fine. They were both consuming all that they could pick since both of these combinations are on their PPFs. This is where it becomes interesting. Assume now that Annie and Bruno decided to trade 10 pounds of apples for 15 pounds of cherries. I don't really need to tell you who picks each fruit because we know that from their pattern of comparative advantage. This pattern of trade is a feasible one, and it makes sense. From Annie's perspective, it is worthwhile this trade. If she were to stay put, she could forego 10 pounds of apples and obtain 10 pounds of cherries. We see that she gets 5 more pounds from Bruno. From Bruno's perspective, if he were to forego 15 pounds of cherries, he would only pick 7.5 pounds of apples. So that's a great trade for him as well. What does this mean then? It means that they can do better by trading that they can do by themselves. Trade allows them to consume outside of their PPF, and that's pretty fantastic. We can look at their gains from trade more closely by filling in this table with Annie's and Bruno's consumption and production patterns both without and with trade. When we allow them to trade, we see that Annie just produces apples and Bruno just produces cherries, and they get to consume some of the other fruit because they got it from the other. When we compare this to their consumption without trade, we see that Annie is able to consume 2 more pounds of apples and 3 more pounds of cherries, and Bruno is able to consume 1 more pound of apples and 3 more pounds of cherries. Both are better off by trading. Both gain from completely specializing according to their comparative advantage. Thank you for watching.